Good evening, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the American Dream Reconsidered Conference. My name is Kyle Beachy, and my field here at Roosevelt is narrative. And the first lesson that any aspiring storyteller learns is that a strong, believable character must be built upon desire. Man is his desire, said Aristotle, along with literally every single creative writing textbook in the history of the field. And if readers are to be convinced, they expect to see that characters confront moments of choice when desires manifest in narrative action. In these moments, readers are invited to pass judgment on a character, share sympathy or antipathy with that character. In short, to treat fictional characters less as narrative constructs and more as fictional selves. Which is all to say that making choices and judging choices are paired cornerstones of the human experience. Our lives, however, tend to be quite a bit more chaotic than the stories we tell, and desires as we know it today is a slippery thing. The calculus of any real-world decision, from the monumental load-bearing choices down to the most routine, even the negligible, are subject to manifold questions of social responsibility, knowledge and ignorance, and the time-relative interests we have in our future selves, our aspirations, and our fears. Our panel discussion tonight invites us to consider these moments of choice and how small personal actions become more or less comprehensible in the context of macro-level concepts such as the American dream. Our moderator for this discussion is Marjorie Jolles, a professor of women's and gender studies and director of the honors program here at Roosevelt University. She specializes in continental and feminist philosophy with a focus on ethics, philosophy of the body, theories of style, and the rhetoric of empowerment. She has published numerous articles and chapters in the fields of feminist philosophy, sexual politics, and cultural studies, and is co-editor of Fashion Talks, Undressing the Power of Style from SUNY Press. And we are fortunate tonight to have two esteemed panelists. First is Agnes Callard, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. She received her BA from the University of Chicago in 1997 and her PhD from Berkeley in 2008. Her primary areas of specialization are ancient philosophy and ethics. Second is Elise Miller-Larsen, an epistemologist and PhD candidate in the philosophy department at Harvard University, whose research is informed by philosophy of psychology, cognitive science, and social psychology. She is concerned with the thoughts we have and how we arrive at those thoughts and whether we can improve our thoughts. Her dissertation, The Ethics of Ignorance, examines the rise of ignorance in our current social political climate, the underlying psychological mechanisms that cause us to be ignorant, and what responsibility we might have for our ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Beachy. It is my great pleasure to moderate this all-philosopher panel, representing the vitality of our discipline and the importance of the humanities in teaching us how to make sense of the most fundamental human experiences. Personal choice may be the most fundamental human experience. We tend to think of personal choice as a primary path to self-creation. Paired with the seductive American dream, we may believe we are born into infinite possibilities, and from there, we compose our lives through careful deliberation and choice. We dream of a future, set some goals, and then go about fulfilling them. Simple. But if the last 19 months have taught us anything, it is that we have, at best, only partial control over how our lives unfold. We may set clear intentions, but one day a global pandemic can shut down life and the plans we made for it. Options vanish. Personal choice is narrowed. And then, from inside those constraints, unexpected fields of possibility, new directions for personal choice that were not available before may emerge. So if the American dream exists, it exists within constantly shifting frames of possibility that we did not choose. We make our choices and we make sense of those choices, which is to say we make sense of our lives from within limits, not outside them. While there are always constraints to personal choice, it's also true that for as long as we are alive, personal choice cannot be avoided. Each of us has made hundreds of choices just today. We've had to. And this is true every day. Now, the stakes of these choices are not all monumental, but some of the choices we've made today surely have, whether we know it or not, set our lives on one path and not another. It's because of these two intertwined and equally compelling facts that our lives are not entirely ours to author, and that we have no choice but to choose, that exploring personal choice is so crucially important, and for philosophers, so crucially exciting. So this conference is about the American dream, and both of you have really interesting biographical relationships to the United States. So Agnes, can you tell us about your personal connection to the US and to the American dream?
The first one's easier. I was born in Hungary, in Budapest, Hungary, and came to the United States when I was about 6, via about a year spent in Rome. At the time, you couldn't leave Hungary legally, but you could travel to Austria, because that's still Austro-Hungarian Empire. You could kind of sneak out to have a vacation in Vienna, and then from Vienna, my parents went to Rome, and then they stayed in basically a kind of hotel that was housing mostly Russian Jews who were being sent to Israel or the United States. My parents initially, I think, thought they were going to go to Israel. They ended up in the United States. And then, so once I was 10, we had American passports, and that meant we could go back to Hungary. We couldn't leave the US until we had passports, right? So then I spent most of the summers from that point on in Hungary. So I kind of grew up a little bit half and half up through college. I guess I think maybe there's kind of a danger of giving a narrative of yourself, right? Like there's a line you gave me that struck me. You said, "If the last 19 months have taught us anything," and I'm like, have they? And that's something I noticed throughout the pandemic. At every point was like, even just weeks into it, we were like, "What are the lessons?" We're really ready to learn some lessons, because that's like a positive that we get out of something, right? So I think we're very. The narrative of, this has taught me something is like very imposing, and it's sort of hard to know. It's hard to know whether I'm the expert of like how this particular life path has shaped me. But so I would say be suspicious of the story I'm about to tell you. But I guess I think that it just, I was not. I went to very Orthodox Jewish, very religious schools in the U.S. And my family was not religious. We were kind of charity cases, so we were able to go to those schools for free. And in Hungary, when I would go there in the summer, my sister and I very much stood out because we had genes. That was like the main thing. We didn't have accents in Hungarian, so they wouldn't have even known that we were not Hungarian, except that we had genes. That was not a thing you could get there. And if I'd been smart, like we wouldn't have worn the jeans. But we're not smart enough. And so that was kind of, it became a sort of social barrier over, not when we were 10, not when we were 11, not when we were 12, but like 14, 15, 16, of like, we come from a rich world, right? And the other kids, the kids that we would play with, we would play ping pong mostly, where my grandmother had a house in Bécs in southern Hungary, were, these are the rich Americans, right? Now, in fact, in America, from American standards, we were not rich, but in Hungarian standards, we could get an ice cream whenever we wanted, right? Whereas they couldn't get whatever they wanted. So it was like a bit of being an outsider in both worlds, an outsider in the American world, because I was with people who couldn't come to my, like the other kids in school wouldn't come to my house for a play date because we were not kosher. They couldn't eat anything in my house, right? In Hungary, it was like we were the Americans. And so that would be the narrative I would give, is something like, growing up a little bit of an outsider everywhere is a bit liberating in the sense that you feel very much like you have this sense of like, I get to choose who I'm going to be. And I've focused on that conceptually in my own work, maybe so that's one story I can tell.
Lovely, thank you. And that really is an iteration of the American dream. I mean, it's apart from the capitalist understanding of it, the idea that as an outsider I can sort of look at a menu of options and make some choices about my life. Yes, no, I understand that very much. Elise, how about you? Can you tell us about your personal connection to the US and if that has informed a relationship to the American dream?
Yeah, so like Agnes, I have a story about fitting in, although I think it took me much longer to get to the positive conclusion that she just gave us of it being freeing. And maybe I'm only just starting to embody that, now that I've gotten to a certain point in my life, because it definitely didn't always feel freeing, the fact that I didn't always fit in. So for my family, I'm half Panamanian, half African American. So my mom was born in Panama. My dad is African American descent. So now I have a term for that. But growing up, we didn't really know what to call ourselves. It was very clear that we weren't fully African American. So my mom would make plantains and rice and peas, and so like arroz con pollo and things like that. And I thought that that's what everybody ate. I actually thought that that's what all Black people ate. So in my mind, I thought I was conforming to what other Americans did. And it wasn't until I was growing up that I realized, oh no, we have a sort of unique culture that maybe everybody doesn't share. And in addition to that, I have family members who speak Spanish. So that makes you a little bit different growing up. Okay, but then on the playground, if people ask, well, what's your identity? Then if I said Latin, there were looks of incredulity that I was maybe lying or making up some identity that I couldn't really count as my own. And then if I said I was fully African American, there was also that sort of hesitancy of not fully conforming to the culture. So again, a little fitting in problem, but like I said, unlike Agnes, it took me a long time to figure out how to be free in that space of defining who I am. And it's only recently that we have terms to help us. So even though I'm a epistemologist, I kind of started in philosophy of language, and I think language is really important. Mm-hmm. And one thing that has helped in this situation is having terms like Afro-Latina, being a term that's becoming accepted in the US, and being able to say that one is Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx, and for people to know what that is, and to know that it's someone who is Hispanic or of Latin American descent, who is also a person of color. So I think that there is progress when we can sort of identify ourselves, and that can make space in the American dream, because a lot of times the American dream seems to have one picture, sort of boxes that you need to check, and like literal boxes. So there was no box to check of being Hispanic and African American until very recently as well. So just being able to be counted as part of, who's American and like what America represents is really important. I don't know if I gave a lesson there, but I guess it's more of sort of like a progress of like how far we've come as a country, and how it allows and gives space for people who come from different backgrounds.
Yes, no, there is a lesson, I think, which is that one's location in relation to, let's say, the US is going to inform how really salient narratives or myths, in the case of the American dream, how those myths are useful. So I'm going to call that a lesson for sure. So philosophers, we really like to start with first principles. And so I thought I would ask both of you to do that around defining personal choice. So at least how, in philosophical terms, would you define the concept of personal choice?
Right. So like I said, because I'm an epistemologist, so technically I study the theory of knowledge, although my work is theory of ignorance. I really think about personal choice as agency, and in particular epistemic agency. So that's thinking about has to do with what we think and like what we believe. So having sort of agency over those aspects of our mental lives. Now, I do see it as like intricately linked with agency in a more general sense of, what we do, our actions. But really, I want to think about personal choices sort of having some control over what we can I guess our mental aspects in terms of like how we can drive our thinking processes, our reasoning processes, and the things that we come to believe in and value as beliefs.
That's great. I love that. Agnes, same question. In philosophical terms, personal choice, if there's a definition you could share?
Yeah. So I distinguish like two kinds of choice that are very different. And in fact, I tend to maybe not even use the word choice for one of them, but I think it's the one you want to talk about. So I'm just going to use choice for both. So there's choosing what to do and there's choosing who to be. Those are two very, very different kinds of choices. And I think they're different because when you're choosing what to do, you're choosing from value. That is, you're taking some values that you already have that sort of like set the terms for what would count as a successful action or a failure, right? What are the things you want to achieve? And you're figuring out, among the space of possible actions, which better matches your value set, right? Mm-hmm. So that's choosing from value. Almost all philosophy about choice is about that. And I think there's part of what my book is arguing is that whole framework that's designed to fit that situation doesn't work very well when what you want to tell the story of is choosing who to be. That's choosing towards value. So you're trying to decide what values you should have, right? And you're not always trying to decide them on the basis of which other values would better satisfy the values you currently have. That's a way you could choose, more values from values you already have. But sometimes what we end up doing is, making really foundational changes to our core values, right? Where they can't be understood as, ways of satisfying what you already wanted in the first place. They're really new. They're really transformative. That's choosing toward value. And that's what we're doing when we're choosing who to be. And those sorts of choices work very differently because we are in a very different epistemic situation, very different knowledge situation with respect to who to be than what to do.
Indeed. And there's a self who's choosing to become a different self, right? So it isn't that that's a space of absence, but that's right, that there's novelty at the forefront of that kind of choice, which may not always be present in choosing what to do, the first version of choice that you described.
Right. Exactly.
So there is such wonderful overlap in the research that you both do. You've both written so much, of course, about knowledge, including self-knowledge and ignorance. And I think we're in such an exciting time when ignorance is being increasingly included in discussions of what we can know. That sometimes ignorance is strategic or deliberate or present. It's not only an absence, right? But it can be a presence. So Elise, as our true expert on ignorance, I thought I would ask you, is there a role for ignorance in personal choice, in making choices? And what I mean is ignorance ever a resource? I mean, I think ignorance is understandably thought of as, again, a lack, an absence, a failure of knowledge. But I also think that sometimes if we fully knew all the risks we were taking, we would be less likely to act. And so another way to think about this is if knowledge is ever an obstacle to choice. So I guess I'll put the question to you those two ways. What is the role of ignorance in making choices?
Great. Yes, I love this question. So there's a lot packed in your question that you've asked, and mainly it's thinking about varieties of ignorance to start. So I do think that traditionally there's one idea about ignorance being a lack or absence and a lack of knowledge in particular. So that's sort of the standard view of ignorance. Although, like, spoiler, it's not going to be the view that I typically endorse as the one that's most problematic, but we can start with that one. So if you start with that as ignorance as a lack of knowledge, then it does seem that there's these like ignorance is bliss cases that are really abundant. And there's times when you think that if you lack certain knowledge, like maybe that's the best case for personal choice. So we can think about cases like getting married. So, if you knew sort of the divorce rate for marriage, would you really want to get married? Would you still think that that's a great decision? Or if you knew like actually what it entailed to like have delivery and like labor and actually give birth to a child, like would you ever think, yes, absolutely, knowing the full extent to what that takes, that I want to have a child? Or even just voting for a political candidate, if you knew all the sort of mistakes that they were going to make ahead of time, would you do that? And it doesn't always have to be like cases of omniscience. It just having certain facts about the world may make it harder for us to choose it all, right? So I do think that there's that sort of like problem that arises when you think about ignorance is not knowing. And that just seems to be like a sort of classical way of thinking about the relationship between knowledge and ignorance, that they're just kind of opposites to each other. That if you have knowledge, then you're not ignorant. And if you're ignorant, then you don't have knowledge in some way. But I'm really worried about this other type of ignorance, which I've been thinking about as not considering. And so this is not just lacking knowledge or lacking what people talk about as like factive knowledge, so facts about the world, which I think you can gain in different like transitions to knowledge. So I just gave some facts about marriage. I don't know if they're still the same, but maybe I can tell you that 50% of marriages end in divorce. And that's like a fact. If you didn't know, now you know, and we just like easily transition you from an ignorant state to a knowledge state. But in not considering, what I'm really concerned about is when people aren't able to open themselves up to possibilities of thought. So the very possibility that something could be the case. And that doesn't seem to happen in normal instances about facts. It seems that we're able to just gain facts pretty readily, more or less, although I can think of a few cases recently where it seems like, you know, given social media, somehow that has become more difficult for us. But before recently, I was confident that like if you told someone a fact, then like it would like be within their repertoire. But what I'm worried about is just like full idea. So I mean, we can go back to your first question. Like the idea that someone could be Black and Afro and Latino was something that was like a possibility that was missing. And that type of ignorance creates larger barriers than just like regular factive ignorance. Okay, so then what is the problem with that? So I think the problem there is that then it really does hinder personal choices, because you're not being able to think about the possibility, and then that can actually end up like harming others. So it's not just that you're missing knowledge, it's that your lack of considering certain possibilities like really hinder your whole world perspective, and then it can also like have effects on other people and people in your community. And I think that's kind of a larger worry that I've been really concerned about recently.
Right, great point. And the impact on others, you know, the connection our personal choices may have on the lives of others is a question I'm really eager to explore in a couple minutes. But Agnes, I thought I would invite you to say a bit as well about the value of ignorance and knowledge. I mean, let's not, you know, exclude knowledge entirely, but how do you see ignorance and knowledge working together in the phenomenon of personal choice?
I tend to be pretty down on ignorance. So I look for opportunities I tend to think it's just bad and it would just be better to know. There's a great paper, I'm sure Elise knows it, by Gregory Kafka that's called Some Social Benefits of Uncertainty. And it's about sort of some of these cases where like, if there was some policy that we were deciding between, like speed limit or something, and we would know in advance which of us is going to die if we raise the speed limit by 1 mile an hour, those people would like really dig in their heels and be like, no, I'm never going to agree to raise it. And so there are like, social benefits to essentially not knowing who's going to be the victim of some policy, right? So I find a really challenging and interesting argument. And I'm like, well, is that really a good argument? Or is this like a way in which we cover over or dress up our victimization of those people? Like, I don't know. But that's one kind of argument that I struggle with and I think is interesting. But in general, I think ignorance is not good, but it is the human condition. And the really deep and dangerous thing is that we are very, very attached to our ignorance in a lot of cases. Like, you know, as Elise was saying, maybe not in most matters of fact, but in matters of fact where we're pretty attached. And so, like, if we don't know, you know, what the right way to live is, say, right? We don't know what kind of political system we should have. We don't know how we should treat our loved ones. Suppose we don't know those things, but we have to pretend that we know, because like we have to do something to get through our day. Like we have to treat our loved ones in one way or another, and we have to think of ourselves as being decent, right? And we have to engage politically. And so there's this way in which our, you know, some of our ethical beliefs, not most matters of fact, of some matters of fact, but some of our ethical beliefs are load bearing with respect to our agency. And so we're not very open to discovering that we're wrong about those things. And in fact, we resist discovering that we're wrong. And that makes it difficult for us to inquire. And so like ignorance is bad, but ignorance of ignorance is even worse. So, the question is how to sort of loosen up your kind of hold. You're kind of clinging to these like moral truths that you think right? How to loosen your hold enough that you can inquire into it. That's, I think, a big challenge for philosophers, like to do that rather than like just moving over totally to the land of abstraction and be like, oh, let's abstractly think about these problems, but like totally detached from life, right? We'll never apply it. We'll never. So like to actually engage with life, once you start engaging with life, you start clashing with the fact that we cling to our ignorance, and philosophers as much as anyone else. So I would say, rather than saying, is there good kind of ignorance, as I say, maybe Kafka has identified one kind, but I would say there's just more and less bad kinds of ignorance, and the kind where it's like reinforced. That's the kind we, I think, really have to fight against somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and especially I would imagine as a social phenomenon. So not only as a personal cognitive or intellectual state, but as a movement, right? Yeah, right. Lethal, potentially lethal. I know it does. I mean, I was thinking a lot about ignorance and its relation to humility, and how in some ways philosophers really model, we aspire, to use your term, to model a kind of not so much ignorance, but humility in the face of partial knowing. And of course, we have figures like Socrates, who are kind of the example of wisdom paired with an embrace, not an embrace, but an acceptance of some ignorance. So Americans, we like to imagine that we have total command over how our lives will go. I mean, I think this is the really alluring, seductive quality of the American dream. And yet we know, and I know certainly students at Roosevelt University are very invested in questions of larger structural forces that constrain choice and may even make our choices for us in some instances. So one may dream of a certain outcome, and one may be blocked by immigration status or the forces of oligarchy, right? That we know that there are forces larger than the individual. And so I wanted to hear from both of you how you understand the tension between free will and personal choice and larger circumstances beyond our control that we know function as a kind of boundary for how far we can go. Agnes, I guess I'll ask you first. How do you understand that? And are there strategic ways to think about how to maneuver when both are true, right? We have free will and we can't do whatever we want, both.
Good. I feel like actually there's sort of three areas one should think about. So like there's where you really have totally free will. And I think you do, but it's with respect to very unimportant choices, right? Like which kind of cereal you're if you're not going with your kids and you don't need to satisfy your kids, you can just choose what kind of cereal to buy. This is not my situation, but it used to be before I had kids. I could just choose what kind of cereal, right? Very free, not very important. And then there's at the other end, right? There's going to be just sort of structural facts that I run up against. There's some way in which my employer manages COVID, right? And I got to live with that. And, I have to, so like, that's just a structural situation that I'm up against. But in the middle, there's such an interesting territory of where the free will of one person hits the free will of another person, right? So like, Elise brought up the example of divorce, right? I'm divorced and remarried, and people don't get married intending to get divorced. Like both people are like freely choosing, like, let's stay married at the beginning, right? How does it end up that the people end up divorced? I don't think it's structural facts so much there. Like they're going to be structural facts, and some marriages face bigger problems than other marriages, but even couples who face really, really big problems sometimes make it through, right? And some couples don't. And there's something about, so to me, like that's a bit that I've been interested in lately anyway, is like, there's this mystery of how and when coordination with other people works and when it doesn't, right? And you can get into these bad equilibria with other people where like every interaction makes, is designed to cause pain. And there is a giant backlog of resentments, right? And I mean, we see this, of course, at a social level, right? But it's for a lot of us, it's how we relate to our parents, our spouses, our kids, right? Our siblings, right? We get into these bad equilibria with people where we're not getting what we want and we're somehow not acting freely. And everyone always sort of somehow sees it's the other person's fault, but they both see it that way, right? And so that's like another space of free will that I think actually that covers a lot of what matters to people, right? So I'm very interested in that area and in trying to think about like, how do you get relationships into good equilibria rather than bad ones?
Fascinating. Elise, your take on this tension between personal agency on the one hand and the larger context on the other, or alongside it.
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot as a tension between agency and ideology, especially bad ideologies. So people talk a lot about how we live in ideological structures, and like bad ideological structures can really impact who we are, right? So it seems to inform personal choice. And so there is like, one story goes that if you're in a bad ideological structure, then maybe you can't help but, for example, be racist or be homophobic, because like that's the ideology that you're sort of like stuck in. And if only you can get out of that structure, then you could have different beliefs. I don't necessarily think that that story is right. I don't think that it's always the case that whatever sort of bad ideology we're stuck in or can always make it so that we have to believe a certain way, or it's likely to, or it's the only rational way is for us to believe in these maybe like non-ideal ways. And I think it actually ends up so that we like blame the wrong thing. So we end up blaming the structure. We say like, oh no, if only I didn't live in this community, then I could have had different ideas or like more egalitarian beliefs about other groups of people. So I think that it gets us on the wrong track. And I think what can help is just really distinguishing like the different pieces of it. So I've been thinking about it as having a difference between like these bad ideological structures and oppressive structures on the one hand, and then also a difference between oppressive structures and being oppressed. So I absolutely think that if you are a member of the press, then you cannot advocate for yourself. There are forces like social, material that really do limit what you can do in your life. What you can get what you can get out of the world, like where you can maneuver, like what job you can get. And those are structures that we do continue to fight. So I think that there is something genuinely big about being stuck in those structures. But I do think that like being truly oppressed across a multitude of boards is hopefully not the case for most Americans. And I'll tell you what I think the difference is. So I think being oppressed means that you can't advocate for yourself at all. Versus like being an oppressive structure. So I think that even as a minority, like I'm constantly in an oppressive structure where I have to fight those battles. And I see it as like being in a boxing ring where you're going rounds, so I go like 10 rounds with racism. Sometimes racism really kicks my butt, but I can go back in there and advocate for myself in a way that someone who is truly oppressed may not be able to advocate for themselves. They may not be able to push back. So I do think that there is this balance like between being able to push, if you can, between the kind of limitations that push against your personal choice and the kind of like genuine choices of like who you want to be. And I think it's just like an ongoing struggle that is unfortunately maybe a part of the American dream. Reconsidered. Yeah, we'll add the reconsidered on that part.
That's right. Well, I mean, what you're saying makes me think that the whole concept of personal choice can sometimes get a bit cartooned, and we think it's either radical freedom as opposed to maneuvering, right? That we can talk about negotiating, maneuvering as one of the ways that one exerts personal choice. It isn't really a binary of one is free or one is not, right? But thinking really critically about where are those openings for movement, and then exploiting them in the good sense of exploitation.
Mhm.
So, Agnes, you are really well known for your work on aspiration, which I personally have learned so much from. And the concept of aspiration I find so useful, really as clarifying the deliberate, motivated choosing to change oneself, what you were speaking about a few minutes ago, right? Which is, different from the choosing what to do. But as we read about in your book, I want to become this kind of person. So there's a self who has identified a future self and wants to sort of then set about becoming. So there's that kind of choosing, sort of big self-changing choosing. And then there are other maybe passive, or at least less active, choices one makes. I get to the train at 8:05 and I decide to get on this car and I meet someone and my life takes a different direction, right? That is not aspiration. That's a sort of chance encounter. But there was choice involved in that encounter, right? That sends my life in a different trajectory. And so I was curious if you have thought about that other field of choice that might not rise to the level of aspiration, but that might be deeply consequential for how our lives might turn out. The part that, the smaller choices that wind up being really important.
Yeah. So, I think first of all, like there's a way in which the smaller choices of just like you chose to take this train as opposed to another one, or you chose to get on, take the train at all. Those are actually, I would say, more directly active and deliberative than the aspirational stuff, because when we're aspiring, we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, at least not that well. And we kind of know that we don't know why we're doing what we're doing because the reason we're doing it is to value the thing that we don't yet value, right? Whereas when you're like, I want to take this train because I need to get there for this time, you can tell the whole story of why you want to do what you're doing, right? But it's just smaller. So it's not less deliberate, it's just smaller and less important. And there, in the case where you're choosing to take your train, right, you're acting from value. That's why you know more, because you already have the value, right? That like lets you know why you're doing what you're doing. You can give a really good answer to why you're doing what you're doing. Now, the thing you said though is that it was like a mixed case, right? Because it's like, well, you have a reason for taking the train, right? But then because you have to get on the train, you have to talk to someone. And now your life takes a different turn. So I think part of my book is like a little bit of a skepticism about the life takes a different turn narrative. That is, look, there's something that happened in that initial encounter. We love the idea of the initial encounter that is very determinative, but there's something that happened, and what happened later wouldn't have happened if you hadn't had that initial moment. But in almost all cases, if that initial encounter led to, let's say, a romance, a career change, the decision to have children, the decision to take on a new social activism project, after the initial encounter, there was a lot more stuff that happened where, in effect, you had to aspire, you had to do aspirational work to come to learn to love this person, learn to like grasp the value of this new career, right? And so it didn't all happen in that first moment, right? But I think we're so enamored, especially of fictional narratives in which like some moment is like, if I hadn't been on that train car, and that's true, it can be the case if you hadn't been on the train car, but it can also be true that being on the train car was by far from sufficient from determining the end, right? And that the story you're telling is a story where you erase most of the work that you did after showing up on the train car. And that work is the aspiration part of the story.
Brilliant. I love it. And I'm struck by the centrality of narrative. You mentioned narrative a moment ago, and so did Professor Beachy in his introduction, that what we're doing in narrative is really imposing a kind of order on what might be otherwise disordered or unordered, maybe, events that our choice may or may not even be implicated in. So really, the narration plays an enormous role in making sense of choice, or even understanding what role choice may have played in sort of the life we find ourselves living. So Elise, same question to you. This distinction between active, motivated choice about big, capital B, big life stuff, and then less active choices that wind up being equally determinative, or at least in the narrative, equally determinative?
Yeah, great. So I really appreciate this question. It really kind of stumped me for a while. And so those are always fun. So I took some time to think about these for several days. And I think one of the reasons why I was stumped is because I really wasn't clear, similar to what Agnes just said about like what constitutes a big choice, what constitutes a medium-sized choice, what constitutes a small choice. And then there was this thought that like, well, I don't know, even the small choice could be constitutive of the big choice. And like it all sort of like leads together into like a fuller story. And part of this, my thinking, was because of the way that I think about the mind, and in the way that I think about ignorance and beliefs, is that it's not just that we have these like deliberative beliefs, like I believe that the talk is going to start at 7 p.m. Like that is something that I like, clearly thought, and it's at the top forefront of my mind. But I also have like all these sort of like background happenings in my mind that also sort of like make up or constitute the things that I believe. And then I think that it also informs my agency, or like the things that I end up doing, or the things that I end up acting on. So it's really hard for me to pinpoint like which things are going to be, the more deliberative decisions, and the things that are just like background that are informing all of those deliberative decisions. And I think that both are going to be equally important in the story that I want to tell about ignorance. That, when you're sort of ignorant, then those sort of background things are going to be like just as influential as the deliberative things.
Yes, great. That's a piece that I hadn't clarified until you just said that, right? So another way in which ignorance is functioning is doing something productive, in the sense of pushing or defining a narrative. So personal choice as a concept, it really privileges the individual, right? I mean, it really privileges the unit, the single person as the unit. But we don't live as strictly isolated selves. We live in community, we live in relationship. And it's also notable to me that the three of us are philosophers and mothers. And, sometimes you have to look pretty hard to see what philosophy has to say about motherhood. So I really wanted to ask you both. And specifically, how ought we think about those others? And that can be our children, but also those other close others who may be implicated in our choices. Do we have a responsibility to consider others when making what feels to us like a personal choice, meaning narrowly defined, contained within the boundaries of an individual life? Elise, as our newest mother of the group, I thought I would ask you first if you've given thought to the influence you may exert over how your child might experience their own field of choice. Do we have a moral responsibility or an epistemic responsibility to be thinking about those others that get implicated in our choices?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so I will share my 3-week now expertise. So everyone write things down. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I think I now see the point of like people like L.A. Paul who talk about transformative experiences. I do think that motherhood takes you in a completely different headspace. I've been thinking about it as like an epistemic cliff. Like I feel like I sort of had one knowledge set and then I just like fell off somewhere. So I'm like maybe rebuilding. I don't know if I have solid ground under me yet, but here are some of my thoughts. I definitely think that this is where responsibility is going to be really important, especially for ignorance. And maybe this is where what we were talking about before, where the sort of like ignorance is bliss thesis doesn't really work when it impacts others. So even if as a new mother, there's a lot of things that I don't know, you guys might think, well, now that I am a mother, there's things that I ought to know. So you add sort of like this normative aspect to motherhood, or the things that I should know as a mother, because it does impact my son. And so I can't just say like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that I was supposed to wake up and feed you, or like, I didn't know that I was supposed to teach you your alphabet. Those are things that, as a society, you might think, well, okay, at some point, even if you were ignorant, you ought not be ignorant anymore. So again, like this is like bringing in norms and obligations on ignorance and knowledge that are really worth outlining. And like you said, I haven't really seen too much in that respect of like sort of like what norms are in motherhood. Well, okay, I would say in philosophy, there's a lot of expectations on motherhood, especially in American society, some that are worthwhile and some that are just completely overbearing, I'll admit. But I do think in general, it is something that needs more thought for sure.
Thank you. Agnes, I'm curious how you've thought about the role you play as a mother in, one of the things we do, as parents, is we make choice available to our child. But we also steer them towards certain choices. And so I'm curious if you've given this thought, motherhood and personal choice, and how
I will say,
and how others, if we don't need to talk only about our children, of course, but how others are implicated in our choices.
Yeah, also one thing that like just Elise was just reminding me, of like what it was like when I had my first kid. I was like 26, and no one my age in grad school or whatever. I was in grad school and I had a kid. And I felt very much that cliff, but it took this very peculiar character that I only theorized later. Like at the time I was just in shock. And the experience that I had was like, there are all these things there that you have to sort of decide about, like pregnancy and are you going to have a natural childbirth? Are you going to have drugs? Are you going to, breastfeed or bottle feed? What kind of diaper are they going to wear? How are they going to sleep? When are you going to toilet train them? Like all of those things, right? And like, so this is like my naive point of view is like, none of these things are important. Like that, it doesn't matter. Like if my kid eats one way or the other, they eat. If they're born one way, if I take the drugs or not, whether the clothing they wear, the diaper, and there was like this giant field of choices and knowledge that had been created. And like, it's almost like I'm in the Twilight Zone because I'm like, none of this actually matters. Like, it's almost like somebody told you had to like wear a very special kind of shoe or something when you were a professor. Like, you better wear the right shoe or something. Like, this doesn't, like, I got to feed the kid. I got to make sure, if they're crying, got to comfort them and whatever. But I think there's like a weird Twilight Zone-y thing that happens, and I'm not sure why it happens, where like by the time I had my second kid, I was able to reflect on it and be like, yeah, these are things that don't matter, but for some reason everyone thinks they matter. So we just kind of go along with it. And, but the first time it was just shock. It was like being in this world where, I found it extremely confusing. So that was like my shock, the epistemic shock, because it was not only that I didn't know stuff, but the stuff that I was supposed to know didn't see, like, what you should eat when you're pregnant. Like none of that seemed important to me. Like it's like, I'll just eat whatever, like if the kid dies, if you eat something, I wouldn't eat it. Right. But like, yeah, there are risks. There are all kinds of risks. Everything you do in life has risks. Right. But all of a sudden, no, it's like, so anyway, that's just a weird thing that we're in. And I don't really know how we got into it. But that for me was the eeriness of, when I became a mother. But
please
say, when like for me, parenting just gets harder and harder. Like I'm sorry, Lisa. Like it's just like, it's actually really simple. We make it complicated with which diaper should they wear, but that doesn't matter. You just kind of feed them and they cry sometimes, and like it's hard in the sense of like you're tired, but it's not hard to figure out. As your kids grow up, they have like psychologies that you don't understand, right? And that's like, my kids sometimes advocate for one another. My 8-year-old will be like saying, like making the case for why the 13-year-old should be allowed to do this thing. He's like, no, you don't understand, right? And I actually really feel that of like, they kind of understand one another in some ways better than I understand them. And they're now in this world, right? Like they're with their friends in school, and it's a different generation from my generation. They have different like values and experiences, right? And so, and yet I have this authority over them, control over them, right? Where I don't understand a lot of what is going on in their lives. And that's just really hard. Like, it's like, if only there were some scientific answer to like what you're supposed to do. So it was, for me, this experience of like the early motherhood, it was like stuff that was sort of easy, but people made it seem hard. And now it's like the stuff that's hard. Like I have 17-year-olds, you got to go to college. Like, how should I think about that? Like, I have no idea. It seems like a really hard problem. And I almost feel like it's weird that we don't seem to be willing to acknowledge how difficult it is to raise children when they're older, and we're overinflating how cognitively difficult it is to deal with them when they're little. That's just
what a great point. And yes, the abundance of decisions that, I mean, I found, and I'm picking up some of this from what you said, Agnes, as well, really revolved around lifestyle, like, are you going to be this kind of American mother? Are you going to, is this going to be your tribe? Are you going to be the type that does, attachment?
Yeah, the work at home versus stay home. Even that to me was like, my mom worked. Like, so it didn't seem like a big deal to me one way or the other.
Right. Yeah. So the choice, there's this artificial like inflating of certain choices.
Yeah.
And then I have found that there's something wonderful and just ever so slightly unsettling when a child's preferences or tastes look remarkably like mine. I start to think about, I mean, I'm sure that's short-lived, but that feeling of like, did she pick this? Or did I? And we're all pretending she did. And that's this, I want my child to experience personal choice in authentic ways. I want it to be an authentic experience. And yet I know that even the most, offhand comment about something I like is going to tip the scale. And again, in a few more years, it's going to tip it the other way. She's going to, want nothing to do with anything I like. But it really is a profound role that we're in that we are molding the aesthetic preferences, the ethical preferences, all kinds of preferences that, of course, are linked to choice. I don't know that there's a way around it, but I think it's a challenge to that kind of masculine subject of philosophy who makes decisions for himself, only affects him. He's kind of an isolated individual, as opposed to someone whose choices radiate into the lives of these close others.
That's really interesting. Can I just quickly say, like, one of the debates that I've been going back and forth that don't matter, but somehow matter greatly is about whether or not we're going to tell our kid that Santa Claus exists. And so on the one hand, people are like, oh, you're going to deny him like this whole thing about who he is and like growing up, and he's going to miss out on like the magic of Christmas. And on the other hand, I'm like, but we're going to be lying to him. And as like a philosopher who deals in ethics, I'm like, lying, as far as I know, is bad. I know there's some debate about different areas, but I mean, what's the benefit of like creating this story that they can believe in and might impact who they are versus like sort of the idea of like denying them this, aspect of their life. And so it doesn't seem like it should matter at all, but this has become like a really like crucial debate in like decision making as like a parent that I was really surprised about. It does matter?
It totally matters. That's a good one.
Okay, good.
Good ones. Yeah, that absolutely matters. That's worth debating over. And notice, like, when is that going to come into play? Like maybe when your kid is old enough to talk to you, right? So like 2, 3, 4, right? Like I think that's when these questions start to get difficult. I agree. I think that's a difficult question.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Very. So good luck with that, Elise.
Thanks.
Report back. Yeah. You have a month and a half. So I began with a comment about the pandemic, and Agnes, I so love your point. We're always looking for lessons, and we want to, of course, extract something of value from a tragic crisis like the pandemic. But I am curious, I guess, as a final question before we hear questions from the audience, if this time, the pandemic and the related crises have informed your understanding, do you feel in November 2021 that the exercise of personal choice, the boundaries of personal choice, the scope of it, do you have a new understanding? Has your thinking about this changed as a result of living through what we've lived through? Elise, I'll ask you first.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I think this is where some of it has felt freeing, right? So personal choice is sort of opened up because it's sort of changed the rules on what's required, especially in academia. Do we have to have all of our conferences in person? Well, seems like we don't. Do we have to have all of our meetings in person? No. And so, people have really enjoyed like the freedom that comes along with being able to open up some of the norms that we got so accustomed to. Now, on the other hand, it's definitely been very restrictive as well and confining of our personal choice. But for me, I think the biggest worry that I've had during this time is really just the difficulty of making choices. So for example, like while I was pregnant, I had to make the choice of whether or not to get the COVID vaccine. And so on the one hand, I had people sending me these things where it's like, if you don't get it, like you and your fetus will die. And then I got other people who sent me these things where it's like, if you do get it, you and your fetus will die. So it was just awful trying to weed through both of those sides, like equally passionate people who cared about me and trying to figure out, what should I do? I think this is a case where, because we're sort of like non-ideal agents and like non-ideal situations, philosophy, although I always like believe that it can help inform us and help guide us, it didn't take me all the way there. I will say that in the end, the decision ended up being made off of sort of, as much information as I could gather and a sense of gut feeling that I was doing the right thing, right? And sometimes that's all we can do. But it just does show the kind of like difficulties that we can come against, and the choice that like personal choice isn't always like straightforward, even when you have these like tools of reasoning and like philosophy that generally can give us an idea of where we should go or like how to aspire to certain things, but maybe can fall short in really difficult situations.
That's really fascinating, right? So that thinking about personal choice in partial terms or sort of as a good enough, right? That because there's a temporal aspect to exercising choice, right? There was a moment where we say yes or no, right? And so we're working with the best information we have at the time, which is never fully comprehensive. Agnes, I'm curious if the experience of the pandemic has informed your thinking, if you feel, if there are novel ways you're understanding personal choice, self-knowledge, 19 months in.
Yeah, I discovered that I'm much more dependent on other people than I thought I was. So like, the first month or two of the pandemic, I kind of kept up my life the way it had been before. And then slowly it just unraveled, like just in terms of being disciplined, getting exercise, making decent food for my family, not having emotional meltdowns. Like, it was like I have this control over my soul, and like I'm like, I got it together, I've got my life together. That takes like a fair amount of emotional and like self-personal energy. And turned out I was getting a lot of that energy from other people. And when those people disappeared, I was like kind of at sea, right? And I, have worked to try to recover some of that. And I think I have, but I'm not like where I was before the pandemic. For me, like Zoom is just like in most contexts a very, very poor substitute, in that I don't tend to get that kind of support. And I've tried to think about why it's so different for me to do something on Zoom than in real life. And I think it's that like my brain doesn't think Zoom is real. Like there's some deep part of my brain where it's like, this is not how people look. They don't look like boxes in front of you. They're supposed to look different. They're supposed to look like three-dimensional. And I could totally imagine a virtual reality thing that could trick my brain, where that would be I would just sound much more like real life. But like, and this is like okay because I'm talking enough that I constantly tell my brain, this is real. This is not a thing where you're allowed to check your email. You're allowed to like zone out. You have to. This is real life. But in any context where it's possible to zone out, I zone out. And like, I really try very, very, very hard. And I've tried to implement so many different strategies of, I had a cup decorating period. Here's like all my cups that I decorated. I would just color different colored cups so that I would at least not be checking my email. I mean, I've got like 100 of these things that I would, because I'm like, well, I could sort of do that, but then be paying attention. How do I get myself to pay attention? It's like, how do I get my brain to think this is real life? But like my brain is really fighting that. So So there's all that like emotional energy and support that I'm getting from other people, that I had been getting from other people, that is just gone in Zoom world. And you know, and like I still have my family, and like I have a pretty big family, and that was great. That like I think I would have really been in trouble without them.
Mhm.
But they're also like, you know, demanding and stuff too. So it's two sides of the coin. But a lot of the kind of intellectual community that I'm part of, it was just really hard to lose that. And so I think I hadn't realized how reliant I was on it until it was
Right. So an interesting example of one of the ways ignorance can circulate, right? That we can experience. Like, we don't know what we're getting until it's removed, and then we realize we were getting it the whole time, right? And you know, the idea that we were, again, sort of like self-contained, bound individuals was a little bit false. Yeah. So we have some questions from the audience, and I'm thrilled that we have a few minutes so I can share them. I want to ask, here's a question from Alexandra, and I'd love to hear both of you respond to this. What is your relationship to books? When did you start reading, and how does reading books inform the choices that one conceives of? Elise, if you have a thought.
Oh, sure. So I actually have a lot of books. I'm pretty connected to them, to my husband's dismay, because every time we move, he's the one who has to carry them. But now we have a rule that I just have to put them in smaller boxes so that he can lift them. But I will not get rid of any books. I will not do ebooks. And that's just the thing that we have in our family right now that he has to accept. But in general, I think that books have really informed my choices, and surprisingly, it's really been fiction. So it's not always philosophy or nonfiction that has really helped like open my mind, but really reading the stories, fictional, like, so I guess maybe like, I don't know, I don't want to say kind of like complete fantasy, but like fictional characters that are realistic can help me like see other perspectives, open my mind to like other worlds, and you know, just how people live in other countries and other ways of doing things and other ways of thinking. Even this week I was thinking about the first time I read A Thousand Splendid Suns, and there's this part in the book where the woman talks about how freeing it is to be in a burqa. And like sometimes I felt like, yeah, I think I would enjoy being in a burqa, like to close off from the world, to just be myself. No one can examine or judge me. But when I first read that, it was so different from what people have talked about in terms of like how people who wear burqas are oppressed and like they don't have choices. But when in reality, like some women feel like it's also liberating. So that kind of thing is where it can help you like open your mind to different perspectives. And I hope that that perspective is genuine because it was fiction, but I'd like to believe that there's some women out there that do feel free when they wear burqas.
What a powerful endorsement for the role of fiction and literature more generally in expanding what's even imaginable. Mm-hmm. Beyond philosophy, you know, much as we all love it. So, right. Agnes, what is your relationship to books, and when did you start reading, and what's the relationship of reading to your understanding about choice?
I would draw a pretty sharp distinction between books and reading in that I'm the opposite of Elise. I hate books. I hate owning them. I'm constantly trying to throw them away or get rid of them. The rest of my family is always hiding books to save them from my purges. I will like love a book. If I love a book, I'll read it, throw it away, just buy it again. I feel I'm supporting the book industry, right? So I'm constantly buying books and then constantly just like trying to get rid of them. There's always a project of like getting rid of books. And I love I love the fact that I can have some books like on my downloaded or whatever, so I don't even have to have the physical object. I don't like the physical objects, but I do like reading. I like the book, whichever book I'm reading, I like that book at the time. It's just once I'm reading it, I want it to be gone. But I do agree with Elise on fiction. Like I love fiction. I'm always reading some. Right now I'm reading Knausgaard's new novel, The Morning Star. Which I like loved the like first 100 pages, and then I'm like, wait a minute, this is just the same thing over and over again. And now I'm around page 300. I'm starting to like it again. So it's kind of a roller coaster of like, but I won't give any spoilers. And I think what I love about fiction is sort of maybe a subset of the thing Elise said. So I think that I love that it like the focus on badness. Like almost all fiction presents to us some human evils. They could be like poverty and suffering. They could be like vices. They could just be like bad equilibria between people, right? But fiction, I think really, especially good fiction, really tends to emphasize the negative in human life. And I think that's a really important tool for learning, because as you're living your life, you have to kind of try to emphasize the positive. You want to try to interpret people well. You want to look for good things you can do, right? I think it's kind of a practical postulate that we look for and towards the positive, and we don't focus on evil or think about evil. But in fiction, we can take this vacation, I think, and like indulge in thinking about evil. Like there's this, the famous line with Tolstoy starts Anna Karenina with where like all the happy families are the same, the unhappy ones. It's not true at all, of course. Like but happy families can be quite different. But what is Tolstoy noticing? He's noticing I always talk about unhappiness, right? And I think that's just because that's your job as a fiction writer, is to talk about like the negatives in the human experience. And I think that's like our best access to it.
Wow. So there's a question that feels really related to what we've been talking about just now. This is from Abby, who asks, what are your thoughts on regret and choice? Helpful learning tool or harmful anchor to lost possibilities? Anyone want to go first?
I think if you ended up if you're like, I've had no regrets, then you've been too conservative in your life. So like you should have some regrets. Like you didn't take enough risks if you have no regrets. That'd be a quick pass on like regret. Like,
Yeah. My husband and I have a saying, like, we want to regret the things that we do, not the things that we didn't do. And so I think that's kind of a similar, it's better to take risk and learn from them than to not take a risk and then wonder what would it have been like if I had taken this risk or like attempted this choice.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, to be a human being is to have regret. I mean, it doesn't mean the choices were bad. It just means that we're capable of imagining like, well, there was scenario A and B, and sometimes I kind of long for scenario B, but I chose scenario A. I just don't know how one gets through a life without that sometimes. Okay, so here's a question from Harper. How do bad choices constrict our future choices? Bad choices.
I don't think they always do. I think they sometimes do, often because a bad choice could be, for instance, a choice to put yourself in a more restricted learning environment, and you won't learn the things that would have allowed you to make the other choices. But sort of apart from that, like I guess there's a very, very big variety of ways that you could do that.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I also struggle with the idea of like a truly bad choice. I think I can imagine something that is really bad, maybe like harming others, hurting people. But in terms of like your own personal decisions or making choices, I can't think of a choice that like, it's difficult to decide in the moment that it's going to be definitely a bad choice that was going to lead you down a certain path. I think those are just like really hard to kind of define, but mostly because I think that like even like your inaction can still be seen as action sometimes. So like when you're really trying to think of like, how are my paths going to create this sort of like causal web to get me to a certain place? It's really too hard to map out. So I guess I'm still like into the like good enough choices with the information that you have, and then, try to maneuver your way through situations as best as possible.
Right. And I was thinking as you were talking just now, Elise, about, again, how much is narrative implicated in understanding choices as bad? I mean, apart from sort of heinous choices that might be seen universally from a certain set of values as bad, there are also, we can narrate the same choice differently at different times in our lives, even. I mean, at age 20, it said the choice looked this way. And now from a very different vantage, I would describe the choice totally differently. Okay, Barbara asks a great question. How much does imagination contribute to being who one is? This feels like, I mean, a question about aspiration and also a question about self-knowledge and ignorance.
I find that when philosophers talk, like philosophers either totally ignore imagination and its importance for human life, or they wildly inflate its practical function. So like someone like Bernard Williams is someone who I would accuse of wildly inflating, in the sense of like, you have to live, you have to live imaginatively and imagine yourself into other possibilities. And like, I don't think we can outstrip our life by imagination very far. That is, we're kind of stuck being the people that we are, and we can aspirationally change, but that's hard work to get other possibilities into view. And like, you don't just get that for free by having an imagination. So I sort of think the imagination gets you a little bit out of, like, it gets you a little bit of space from the stuff that is immediately impinging on you, and and it gives you a little bit of space away from thinking in the way that everyone around you thinks, but not very much.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Agnes. I think philosophers take it in two different directions, where like if it's not present at all or it's like overly present. So I recently saw this title for imaginative resistance, and in my mind, I thought it was this one thing about like maybe like the way that we imagine resistance in terms of like social change. And I like created this whole theory that that's not what it was about at all. It was about sort of like constraints when like in like imaginative resistance and like when we're reading fiction. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that is one way that we could worry about it. But there is this other way that maybe I was going down, where you think about imagination as being able to like open your mind to the kind of things that you can do for your life. So thinking about dreaming, like what do you, and this is where aspirations come in as well. Like I think if you like sort of like limit your imagination in terms of what your aspirations can be, then you can only go as far as you think is possible. And so I guess that's the sort of role that I've thought about, but I definitely haven't seen that discussed in detail in philosophy.
And it's such an American dream adjacent response that we, the dream has to motivate us, right? We need to begin with a dream. And there's a fascinating question from Elizabeth that is kind of asking this question from a different perspective, which is, don't we frequently become significantly different characters than we once were without knowing how we were transformed and without knowing what our character currently is? And then Elizabeth mentions that there's a Talking Heads song about this. I'm sure there is. So yes, this is more about maybe unintentional becoming, that we do become significantly different, perhaps without a plan, a blueprint, an aspiration.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like just the life habits and patterns of academic philosophers, say someone who's had tenure for 10 years. I mean, I'm not quite there, but that's like close, 10 years, 20 years. And you compare that to like philosophy grad students.
Right.
There's a lot of differences in how these people live, and their predictable patterns. Like there's guesses you can make as to like what's gonna, like, it's not everyone the same, right? But and I think a lot of those changes are not like in any sense driven by the person themselves. They're just sort of stuff that happens to you. Like people lose energy, and they also, all of us get kind of stuck in the status quo. Like grad school is a very changey time of your life, and everybody started at one institution for a really long time, right? I think some people become cynical. Now I'm not talking about philosophers in general. People become cynical or corrupt over time, right? Subject to certain kinds of influences. That would not be aspirational by my definition. So my definition in my book, aspiration has to be towards an actual valuable thing.
Right.
So the interesting question to press me on would be, could there be a case where somebody changed radically in the direction of improvement and in a systematic improvement, but without knowing how they were transformed, knowing what their character currently is, or even noticing that they're changing? That's a hard story. Imagine trying to tell that story. Right? I'm trying to write the novel of it, right? It'd be a hard story to tell, I think. I'm not, who am I to say it's impossible? But it's striking that isn't the story that we tend to encounter. We tend to encounter negative transformations that have that effect, or sort of cases of drifting, right? Or cases of the pressures. So I do think that it's like becoming good tends to take effort. And so it tends to require being able to direct that effort at a goal in some even just vague sense. And maybe it's like no one gets that lucky, to be just transformed into some really great condition without having to work at it at all.
And maybe the surprise or the element that isn't planned is when we sort of become more than that we couldn't have planned, sort of that, Foucault's notion of becoming other than oneself through disciplined behavior. It's kind of a surprise to the self.
Oh, right. So I don't think it can be fully planned. But I'm trying to consider, could it be not at all? Could you be totally unaware of it? Right.
Right.
And I think you could be totally unaware of becoming bad. Or very, let's say.
Yes.
But could you be that unaware of becoming better? That's harder for me to
because it's so effortful. Elise, thoughts on this about becoming other than oneself without knowing?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Agnes. And it seems really unlikely that you could become better without being aware of it at all. So there might be moments of surprise. So, if we're thinking about in academia, you're in grad school, you're sort of picking up things. Maybe you don't think that you're doing an exceptionally good job at it. Like you're going to your classes, like you're doing the best you can, but you don't really think that you're excelling. But then there's these moments of surprise where then you start teaching and these words come out of your mouth and these things get on the board and you're like, oh, I guess I did learn some things about Socrates, and like here I am telling you about them, and like that's great. But so there's these moments of realization. So I don't think that you're always in the dark about these transformations. You might not pick up like all the micro moments, but if you have sort of the big picture aspiration, then it seems like eventually you'll realize when you get into it. And even the sort of maybe we'll call this one negative things, but I do think that you realize that as well. So like academia can be really like a solo project, so you spend a lot of time alone doing research, and this might lead one to be more socially awkward than you were when you first started on the journey. And so there's moments when you realize that and you're like, how did I get to be so socially awkward? Well, I don't think you're in, well, I mean, at least for myself, I haven't been in the dark about this the whole time, but there was like a moment when I guess I wasn't, and now there's moments when I like sort of see that come out more and more. So again, this sort of like being sort of radically in the dark doesn't seem as plausible to me for either the good or the bad case.
Thank you. So a great question from Keith, which feels related to our discussion about the onslaught of choice when one is becoming a parent. Keith asks, I have heard modern life described as having too much choice, albeit much of it largely trivial. How do we deal with choice overload?
I guess I think like it matters whether you're sort of using the choice to control something. You can always deal with choice by picking randomly, right? So there's an easy solution to choice overload. Just randomly pick one, doesn't matter. I do a lot of random picking, like restaurant menus. Like I will choose within 10 seconds and I'll just like pick something. I like most food, so it'll probably be fine, right? So So that's the way to deal with it. But the issue is like a lot of, but how do you know when to use random picking versus like deliberating? And how do you know how much to deliberate? And I think like sometimes you just feel like deliberating, and it can be fun to deliberate about something. Like suppose you really want to get into like, which kind of diaper am I going to use? Like if you enjoy that, why not? Sure. Right. So I think that the question you have to ask yourself is like, what else could you be doing were you not engaging in deliberation over this particular choice? And like, if you're using that deliberation to avoid doing other important tasks, even other important cognitive tasks, even dealing with forms of ignorance you might have, or et cetera, right? Then that's bad. But otherwise, it's kind of like, I think people like choosing. People like making choices. And so they kind of enjoy having the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, this is from the paradox of choice, right? So like the fact that, especially in our modern society, like we have like too many choices, and wouldn't it be better if we had a more simple life where like choices were limited? So like, you know, restaurants like the Cheesecake Factory where there's like 100 choices. I wonder, do you do the same thing there, Agnes, where you're just like, I don't know, there's like 10 different seafood dishes, like 10 different burgers, like 10 different like steak entrees, and just, you know, how do you even know which category to go into? So I can see, you know, the kind of dilemma of like getting stuck where you're thinking like, okay, you know, could I really make a bad choice? But I guess that's where like risks come in, and like risk analysis would come into play. And for like decisions like what food to get, like, you know, if you are someone who just like likes most food, like the risk is so low that again, like why spend the effort? But if the risk is going to be something greater, you know, again, for motherhood, there seems to be like these big risks, and then there seems to be things that, you know, yeah, like as long as I'm feeding the baby, it seems like whether I like breastfeed or give formula, like both seem to get to the end that we're looking for. Versus, I can't think of other big risks. This is my limit in motherhood. There have to be other like risk things that risk of like death, I'm thinking. Then those are definitely decisions that you want to spend more time on.
Right. And sometimes one does not know what category they are in. Am I in a catastrophic choice scenario? You know, am I a catastrophic risk, or is it you know, is the cereal choice really just a cereal choice? So here's a wonderful question from Caitlin, and I would imagine we only have time for one more. So Caitlin says, I really enjoyed Professor Callard's essay on marital loneliness. Me too. Beautiful. Everyone get the New Yorker from 3-4 weeks ago-ish.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you talk, and this is really for both of you, can you talk about choice and relationships?
Yeah, so when I said earlier that like when you're talking about you know, where your freedom of the will comes up against external constraints, that there's like the two poles of like where you're totally free and where you're totally constrained. And then there's this middle area of like, and this is what I was sort of referring to, right? There's this middle area of relationships where like it isn't you know, how a relationship goes for some mysterious reason isn't any kind of direct function of the choices of the two parties, right? Like a relationship is not a continuous negotiation or something, right? It's not like a business deal, and I don't think it can be analyzed into a set of micro business deals either. Contra some economists, right? I just don't think that model is a good model, because there's so much that's going on that the parties aren't aware of, right? And so the framework of choice, I think, is actually less useful. Like choice is I think the framework of choice works best when we're deciding from value. So we're deciding what to do, right? And where we have some sense of what it is that we want and what it is that the options are that might satisfy us. And I think that in relationships, we often don't. And that's partly because we want what we want to be shaped by what the other person wants, right? So if we were fully determined in what we wanted independently, like, look, whatever you want, I know I want to eat this kind of food and go to this movie for dinner, right? And like whatever you want, that's what I want. And now we're going to negotiate, and I'll see how much I can get of the thing I wanted. Like that wouldn't work very well in a marriage, right? You want, in effect, your wants to be shaped by one another. And so that process is not really a process of choice as I see it. And that's why since choice is less applicable, freedom is less applicable. And so this question of like, why is it that we get into, you know, in effect, bad relationships, bad equilibria, bad feedback loops with people that we're close to and that we love all the time? I see as one of the deepest questions in like philosophy that I think is really understudied by philosophers personally.
Well, we look forward to your next book.
I know. I feel like I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm like, so tell me,
like,
what's that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Elise, do you have thoughts about choice in relationships?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are definitely more inchoate here, but I think there's definitely something important about like ignorance in terms of choice in relationships. And again, there's this question of like the fact that you get into things not knowing, and that's usually what really can impact maybe negatively a relationship. So, you meet someone, like you have all these ideas of who they are, like maybe you date for a while, maybe you date for a long time. And there's something about marriage that like is one of those, I'll call it again, like an epistemic cliff, where there's something you were ignorant about that person until you suddenly get into this like high stakes relationship setting where like if you live together and you have to make your decisions together, and again, your desirings are kind of more intricately linked, then it like sort of changes your knowledge base about that person. And usually there's again these like surprises that you were like, how did I not know? How did I not see this? Like, where was I for the first few months or years of this relationship before you got into the marriage? And so I don't, again, have any answers to these things, but definitely stuff that I've begun to think about of like, what is it about like our inability to assess evidence when it comes to the people that we're around. And sometimes I'm surprised at myself as a philosopher who like thinks about evidence and reasoning. And I'm like, how did I miss these things that were maybe in reflection right in front of my face, but I wasn't able to put them together in my decision-making process and get, and the result is the sort of like feedback loops that Agnes was talking about, where like sometimes they're not always positive, but we find ourselves in them. So again, like future exploration for sure.
Right. Yeah. But I really love, and this is I actually find this a very wonderful, hopeful note to end on, which is there is a place, I don't think we can entirely eliminate irrationality. Choice we tend to think of as a rational thing. Choice comes from a place of rationality. And I want to maybe just consider that there is an irrational component, or can be an irrational component as well, that seems pretty important and possibly pretty valuable. So I could talk to both of you all night. It has been such an honor to be a part of this conversation with both of you. You're such brilliant, brilliant thinkers. And as a way of closing, I want to turn to our president, Roosevelt University's president, Ali Malekzadeh, to say a few closing words.
All right, here I am.
Hello.
This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Callard, Ms. Larson, for these insightful and inspirational discussion of personal choices. And of course, I would like to thank Dr. Jolas for moderating and Dr. Beachy for introducing the panel. Now, any consideration of the American dream needs to take into account the role of choice in our lives. And it was absolutely fascinating to me to listen to today's panelists explore this issue. The best example of what you were talking about is, to enter the United States, go to a Safeway store, go to the cereal section, and talk about 8 zillion choices that you have. It is just coming from abroad. This is the most fascinating thing about American life and the choices we make. And then we'll go to Trader Joe's, and it's fine. But there are fewer choices, and we're happy with that as well. Now, I hope that these remarks tonight will help all of us make better choices and show greater wisdom in what we do. Now, we have several other panels coming throughout this week, the American Dream Reconsidered. And I really hope to see many of you at all these wonderful, wonderful talks that are coming up. So thank you and good evening to all of you.